On the morning of October 14, 1943, a formation of 291 American B-17 flying fortresses crossed the German border, heading southeast toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The raid was the second attempt to destroy Germany's most critical bearing production, the factories whose output supplied virtually every piece of rotating machinery in the German war machine, from tank turrets to aircraft engines to naval guns. The first raid, 2 months earlier, had inflicted significant damage and cost 60 bombers. American planners believed a second raid would finish what the first had started. They had accepted that losses would be severe. They had calculated that the strategic result was worth the cost. In the fighter control rooms that tracked the approaching formation, Luftwaffe controllers began directing their best to intercept. The pilots who responded to those vectors were, by any objective measure, among the most experienced combat aviators in the history of aerial warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Egan Meyer had 102 aerial victories and had developed the head-on attack as the primary tactic for defeating heavy bomber formations. Major Hermann Groff had 212 victories. Captain Walter Nowotny had 258 victories and would reach 258 by the year's end. These were men who had been flying combat missions continuously since 1939, who had accumulated thousands of hours of experience against British Spitfires and Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, against Soviet fighters in quantities that seemed inexhaustible over the Eastern Front, and who brought to each engagement a reflexive tactical mastery that only years of survival in sustained aerial combat can produce. Against them, on October 14, 1943, Flumeric had, in many cases, been commercial pilots or crop dusters or weekend flyers a year before. The B-17 gunners defending the formation had completed gunnery training courses of 6 to 8 weeks. The fighter pilots of the escort, limited by range to the German border and unable to accompany the bombers to Schweinfurt, had accumulated flight time measured in hundreds of hours, rather than thousands. By every individual performance metric, the German pilots were superior. The Schweinfurt raid cost 77 bombers 26% of the attacking force, and more than 650 American aircrewmen killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was, by any assessment, a catastrophic American loss that temporarily halted the strategic bombing campaign and forced a fundamental reassessment of whether unescorted daylight bombing of Germany was sustainable. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots had won, and they were losing the war anyway. The paradox at the heart of the air war over Germany is one that military historians have examined extensively and that popular accounts almost universally oversimplify. Germany had, for most of the war, pilots who were individually superior to their American and British counterparts. And those superior pilots were systematically defeated by an air force that produced adequate pilots in quantities that individual excellence could not overcome. Understanding how this happened requires understanding the two systems, the German and the American, that produced the pilots who flew against each other, and why those systems reflected fundamentally different answers to the same question about what air power was supposed to do. The Luftwaffe's pilot training system was built on the premise of excellence. The pre-war selection process was extraordinarily rigorous in some years. Fewer than 3% of applicants were accepted into pilot training. Those who were accepted underwent a training program of remarkable thoroughness, accumulating 200 to 250 flight hours before receiving their wings and a further period of specialized training in their assigned aircraft types before being posted to operational units. The pilots who entered combat in 1939 were, by any measure, professional aviators of the highest quality. The system had a structural feature that seemed, in the early war period, like a strength and proved, in the long run, to be its most critical vulnerability. German pilots flew until they were killed. Wounded beyond return to service, or the war ended, there was no rotation system. There was no mechanism for bringing experienced pilots home to serve as instructors and multiply their skills through the next generation of trainees. The experten, the aces who accumulated hundreds of victories, accumulated those victories by flying continuously, day after day, for years. Erich Hartmann, who finished the war with 352 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total in the history of combat aviation, flew approximately 1,400 combat missions. The experience he represented was irreplaceable and unreplaced. When he was a prisoner, it was gone from the Luftwaffe entirely. The replacement pilots, who entered the system as losses accumulated, faced a training program that was progressively compressed as the war's demands intensified. By 1943, the average Luftwaffe pilot entering combat had approximately 160 flight hours, still substantial by comparison with what American training was producing, but dramatically reduced from the pre-war standard. By 1944, the training time had been reduced further. Fuel shortages meant that training flights were being cut, and pilots were arriving at operational units with experience levels that their predecessors would have considered inadequate for anything but basic flight operations. The men at the top, the survivors of the early war, who had flown 200 and 300 combat missions, were still extraordinary. But they were fewer each month, and the men replacing them were less and less capable of operating at the tempo and with the proficiency the situation demanded. The Luftwaffe was consuming its seed corn and had no mechanism for replanting it. The American system was built on an entirely different premise, one that its critics inside and outside the American military sometimes characterized as mass production of mediocrity, and that its results demonstrated was something quite different. The systematic production of adequacy in quantities that excellence could not defeat in aggregate. The Army Air Forces training pipeline in its wartime configuration was one of the largest and most complex educational enterprises in American history. At its peak in 1943 and 1944, it was producing approximately 100,000 pilots per year from training programs that processed candidates through primary, basic, and advanced phases at fields scattered across the American Southwest and South. The total flight time that a pilot accumulated before receiving his wings was approximately 200 hours, comparable to German pre-war standards. Though the German pilots had more specialized training on operational aircraft types before their first combat missions, the critical difference was not the quantity of training hours, but what happened after the training was complete. American pilots who survived their first operational tour, typically 25 missions for heavy bomber crews in the European theater, 50 missions for fighter pilots, were rotated home, not to inactivity, to instructor positions in the training pipeline, where their combat experience could be transmitted to the next generation of trainees in a way that no syllabus could replicate. The knowledge of what German fighter pilots actually did in combat, the specific tactics, the preferred attack angles, the recognition of when a German pilot was about to brake and which way, could be taught by men who had survived it in a way that it could never be taught by men who had only read about it. The rotation system multiplied the value of every experienced American pilot. One pilot who survived 50 missions could train, perhaps, 50 subsequent pilots in the specific knowledge that survival required. The Luftwaffe system allowed no such multiplication. Its veteran pilots' knowledge died with them or remained locked in a single cockpit, producing victories that were individually impressive and strategically irrelevant because they could not be transmitted to the men who would need to replace them. The P-51 Mustang, which entered service as a long-range escort fighter in late 1943 and early 1944, is the technological development most often cited as the turning point of the air war over Germany. the aircraft's ability to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, protecting them from German fighter interception during the entire mission, genuinely transformed the strategic bombing campaign's sustainability. But the P-51 was flown by pilots who had been produced by the American training system in the quantities and with the rotation multiplied experience that the system provided. The aircraft and the system were not separable contributions to the outcome. The aircraft gave American pilots the range to meet German pilots everywhere. The system gave them the numbers and the transmitted experience to defeat those pilots in aggregate despite individual inferiority. The specific battle that makes the systemic dynamic most visible is not Schweinfurt, where German excellence won a tactical engagement, but the Big Week, the coordinated American bombing offensive of February 20th through 25th, 1944, where the American system demonstrated that tactical victories could not protect against systemic defeat. Big Week targeted German aircraft production facilities across a concentrated operational period designed to destroy not just the planes Germany had, but the capacity to build replacements. In 6 days of operations, American HEVMERs flew approximately through an individual bombe sortie, escorted by P-51s and P-47s that for the first time could stay with the bombers throughout the mission. American losses were severe, approximately 250 heavy bombers and 2,600 aircrew over the week. The Luftwaffe fighters, who rose to defend against this sustained assault, performed in individual engagements with the skill that their experience warranted. But the aggregate mathematics of the week's fighting was not in the Luftwaffe's favor. German fighter losses during Big Week amounted to approximately 355 aircraft. More importantly, the pilots of those aircraft, pilots who had survived in 1941, 1942, and 1943, accumulating the experience that the system provided no mechanism to transmit, were gone. The replacement pilots, who would fly in March and April and May 1944, would have fewer hours of training, less experience with the American tactics they would face, and no veterans to teach them what the men who had just been killed had learned at such cost. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 8th Air Force during this period and who understood the systemic nature of what was happening better than most of his contemporaries, described the strategic logic in terms that were simultaneously simple and devastating. "We are not trying to win individual engagements," he said. "We are trying to destroy the system that produces German fighters and the pilots who fly them. Every German ace we kill takes with him an investment of years that Germany cannot replace. Every American pilot we lose takes with him 6 months of training. The mathematics are not equal. Doolittle's mathematics were not equal. The German pilot who had flown 300 combat missions represented an investment in training, experience, and survival that had taken for years to accumulate, and that the Luftwaffe had no mechanism to replicate at the rate the war was consuming it. The American pilot with 30 hours of total flight time who flew as his wingman's replacement represented an investment of 6 months and, through the rotation system, access to the transmitted knowledge of everyone who had survived the training pipeline before him. When the German veteran and the American novice met in the air over Germany in the spring of 1944, the German pilot usually won the individual engagement, and the Luftwaffe kept losing pilots it could not replace to an air force that was producing replacements in quantities its planning had not modeled. The personal testimonies of German pilots who survived the war illuminate the systemic dynamic in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. General Arland, who commanded German fighter forces for much of the war and who was interrogated extensively by American officers after his capture, described the evolution of the pilot quality problem with unusual precision. In 1940, he said, we were fighting British pilots who were, man for man, perhaps our equals in skill and courage. The outcome of individual engagements was a function of aircraft performance and tactical situation. By 1944, we were fighting American pilots who were, man for man, significantly less experienced than we were. The outcome of individual engagements often favored our pilots, and we were being defeated. Galland identified the mechanism with the clarity of a professional who had been watching it happen from the inside. The American system was not trying to produce pilots who could defeat our best individually, he said. It was producing pilots who could survive long enough to become difficult opponents in numbers that made the aggregate engagement unfavorable regardless of individual results. Our system produced men like Hartmann who were individually extraordinary. Their system produced an air force. In the end, the Air Force won. Galland's formulation, their system produced an air force, is perhaps the most concise description available of the central dynamic of the air war over Germany. The Luftwaffe produced extraordinary individuals operating within a system that could not sustain them or replace them. The Army Air Forces produced adequate individuals operating within a system that multiplied their effectiveness, transmitted their experience, and replaced their losses faster than the Luftwaffe could exploit them. The German pilot who flew 300 combat missions and survived was, by late 1944, a man operating a declining asset within a bankrupt system. His individual skill was real, his victories were genuine, and none of it was enough, because the system that produced his opponents was doing something that no amount of individual excellence could overcome. It was producing an air force that got larger and more experienced every month while he's got smaller and less experienced at the same time. The American pilot with 30 hours of flight time who met him in the spring of 1944 did not need to win that specific engagement. He needed to survive it or be replaced if he didn't, and he needed to be part of a force large enough that the Luftwaffe could not afford the rate of trade that the engagement produced. He was, the force was, and the German pilot with 300 combat missions, extraordinary, found himself in a war that his personal excellence could not win and that the system he served could not sustain. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.